Hello friends, today I would like to talk about the poem Easter 1916 written by William Butler Yeats. William Butler Yeats, who was born in 1965, is an Irish poet and a dramatist, and one thing I would like to mention is that his name, though it is written as Yeats, is pronounced as Yeats. It would do good to remember that. And he was a prominent person in the literary circles of his time, and he was actively involved in this movement called the Celtic Revival, where he and a few others, Lady Gregory and a few others, where they tried to safeguard and to carry forward and to preserve Celtic literature, including Irish literature, to safeguard it from the onslaught of English writing. And so they tried to collect and preserve Celtic folk songs and Celtic art forms, and Yeats also employed an abundance of Norse and Celtic mythology in his works. And so that is one thing we should remember about Yeats. And yet another thing is that he was also actively involved in the Irish theatre movement. He and J.M. Singh, who wrote Riders to the Sea, they were all associated with Irish drama too. Yeats was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1923. And when we talk about Yeats, we should also remember that he's got a very special Indian connection, because he was closely associated with Rabindranath Tagore, our own poet laureate who won the Nobel Prize in 1913. It was Yeats who helped Tagore in revising, and because we know that Gitanjali was written in Bengali and later it was translated into English, and Yeats was a person who was very much interested in Indian mythology and Indian and Hindu spiritual practices. And so when he met Tagore, they struck off immediately, and their friendship grew famously, and he offered help in revising the English translation of Gitanjali, and was also kind of instrumental in Tagore's work becoming popular in those parts of the world. He gave a lot of he spoke to many people about Tagore, and he helped Tagore, introduced Tagore to many important persons then. And so he is remembered for this very special bond he shared with Tagore. And it is also said that in his in the Irish town of Sligo, there is a bust of Tagore, which the Irish government has put up as a mark of respect to its ties with India. So that is another thing about Yeats and India. And now coming to this particular poem, it is titled, as you can see, Easter, 1916. And one would think, judging from the title, that it is a poem about Easter celebrations or the religious significance of Easter, but then it has nothing to do with Easter, looking at it from that point of view. Instead, the poem talks about the Easter rising or the Easter rebellion that happened in Ireland in the Easter of 1916. Now, before we launch into the poem, I think I should also mention that Ireland and England had a very turbulent relation, and for a long time there were power struggles going on between the two nations. Ireland being the smaller nation, there was always this threat of being overpowered by England, and England had established power over Ireland. And the Irish people, at least quite a few of them, bristled at the authority of England, and they did not like the British government meddling in their affairs, and so on and off. There were rebellions and struggles being put up against the British government. And the Easter Rising or the Easter Rebellion was one such rebellion which happened during the Easter week in April 1916. And it was, to be exact, it started on April 24th of the year 1916. And a few Irish Republicans, they launched an attack against the British rule in Ireland. And at that time, Britain, you remember the year is 1916, and Britain was actively engaged in the First World War. And seeing this as the right opportunity, the Irish rebels, they decided to stage a rebellion. And they, after planning and plotting for some time, they decided to attack the strategic British posts in Dublin on this particular day. And that is how it all started. And this plan was not known to many. Now, Yeats, for instance, was actively involved again in the Irish Republican movement. He personally was not for violence. He denounced the participation in of Britain in the World War. He spoke against war, and he had made quite a number of enemies on this count, and he was never for violence. And in the case of Ireland, talks had been going on between Ireland and England regarding the granting of independence, and England had given assurance that soon they would look into the matter and decide, decisions would be taken about granting independence to the nation. So this was the background, and then all of a sudden there was this outbreak of this revolution, and some 1,000 people took part in this, and there were almost 485 people were killed. Among these, 260 were civilians who were caught in between, and 143 were British military and police personnel, and 82 were Irish rebels. And of these, all the leaders, they were very soon caught and rounded up, and 16 of them were executed. In May of that year, 16 of them were executed. They were shot dead as in retribution to their action. And so that was the Easter Rising. So it is based on this that this poem was written. And Yeats, though he was not an open supporter of violence or rebellions, he had to write a poem because this was something that happened in front of him, and he couldn't kind of ignore the event. And this the Irish Republican Army, though they did not have a lot of supporters, after this event they grew in esteem. The sacrifice of so many lives and the young leaders all being put to death, it stirred nationalistic feelings in the Irish minds, and it gave a lot of impetus to the Irish independence movement. And he wrote this poem that very year in 1916, and it was published separately as that poem alone. He first read it in pamphlets in closed circles, and then the poem was published in 1916. And later on, in 1920, this poem was once again published in a collection of his poems called Michael Robartes and the Dancer. And now let's take a look at the poem. It is some 81 lines long. So there are 4 stanzas of varying length. Now in the first stanza, this is how it goes. In the first stanza, he tells us about, he doesn't give us any names, but he tells us about how he knew many of these men. He was at least, maybe though he was not very close with them, he was at least acquainted with many of these heroes. And then in the second stanza, he talks to us about 4 of these people. He tells us what he knows about them. And then in the third stanza, he talks about how this idea of a rebellion entered their minds and it stuck there, refusing to let go of them until they decided to act. And finally, in the last stanza, towards the end of the poem, he gives us a list of the names of the people, and he also ponders on the sacrifice that they made. So let's go on to stanza 1. Easter 1916. I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head or polite meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite meaningless words, and thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is moon, all changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Now this line, a terrible beauty is born, is repeated at the end of 3 stanzas. Except in the third stanza and all the others, you find that this is the last line. So the line acts as a kind of a refrain to the poem. So he says, the first line, he says that I have often met these people, them. He doesn't say who they are, but then we understand he's talking about these people who had suddenly overnight turned into great national heroes. So when he knew them, he says they were just ordinary people like me. I have met them at the close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. So he's talking about maybe the city of Dublin, where there were old 18th century houses, grey ones. And he says, I've often seen them, different people with different faces, from different places too, because some of them maybe were working from counter or desk. Some of them must have been working in offices, some of them may have been students. So he had often seen them in the evenings. And I have passed with a nod of the head or polite meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite meaningless words. He remembers that he even has spoken to a couple of them. He passed them nodding his head, because when you see acquaintance, you have acquaintances and you have friends, isn't it? Friends are people who you spend a lot of time with, who you talk a lot with. Acquaintances are the one that you smile at when you see them. You nod your head to acknowledge their presence. You just make a casual exchange of a few words about the weather or about some current issue. So that is all. So he says that is all I too did with these people. I have passed some of them with a nod of the head, or maybe I have spoken some polite, or we have exchanged some polite meaningless words to each other, and lingered a while and said, and again there have been sometimes maybe the encounter was a little longer. They stood together for a few moments and spoke to each other. Again, he doesn't remember what exactly they spoke. All that he remembers is that there were some polite, meaningless words. And a thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion. So now when he looks back, he can even recall how he has said some mocking tale or a jibe about a few of these people at a night club. You know, when you sit around relaxing with your friends, that often happens. You know, maybe in the college, the canteen, you sit there and you are chatting with your friends, having a nice time, and suddenly somebody passes by and immediately you tell your friends, no, don't turn and look now, but you know that man who is wearing that red checked shirt, and you go and say some story, or the girl who just came in now, don't look now, but I have something to tell about her. You know, we have often done this. And so he says that even he can recall talking something like this of a mocking tale or a jibe. Jibe is a joke to please a companion around the fire at the club. And being certain that they and I but lived where mortally is born. So he says then he thought of them and himself on equal terms. Both of them, whether it is him or whether it is them, they both wore motley. Motley, what is a motley, by the way? Motley is the dress worn by a circus clown, a patched up dress of various colors. So that's a motley. And here motley is a symbol of ordinary common people, ordinary lives, nothing outstanding, people living a very routine kind of a life, moving from home to workplace and from workplace to home, in between a few friends, nothing interesting, nothing spicy, nothing adventurous, that kind of a life. So motley might symbolize that, the commonplace day-to-day routine and life, and common people like him. And it might also, in looking at it, placing it in the larger picture, I guess it might also mean that, you know, these writers of the modern time, especially during the World War time, the World War and the violence, it had given rise to all kind of questions about existence, and again philosophies like existentialism. It had prompted people to think about the meaning of life, and often they realize that life itself is meaningless and there is no purpose in life. There is no point in making long-term plans, because nothing could be predicted about life. And so maybe a human life itself was a kind of a joke. So maybe that is what is signified by motley. So that's why he says, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is born, all changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. So he says, till this rebellion occurred, I thought that we were all the same. These people and me, I thought we were all very similar, very same. But now everything is changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. So this Easter rising has changed everything. A terrible beauty. Now that is what you would call an oxymoron. Two opposing words of two opposing meanings clubbed together, an oxymoron. Terrible and beauty, they generally don't go together, do they? And so why do you think he has put them together? So what is terrible here? The terrible thing is that a rebellion took place. The terrible thing is that there was violence where many people were involved, and the terrible thing is that death descended upon them, and almost 485, how many did I say? 485 people were killed, and many young men, many young people lost their lives. 16 of the leaders were put to death. So all this is terrible. And what is the beauty? The beauty is that this event or this incident, it brought out the heroism in these people. It revealed to the world that they were not just ordinary people, but they were people capable of such courage. And this Easter rising also gave rise to nationalistic feelings, and it gave a great impetus to the Irish independence movement. So looking at it that way, it is beautiful too. So that is why I guess he has made this combination, a terrible beauty is born. So till then we were all similar, we were all common ordinary people, but now everything has changed, a terrible beauty is born. Now he goes on to stanza 2, where he says, or he talks about these people. Individually he takes them one by one. He doesn't give the names, even now he hasn't given the names, He hasn't given the names, but of course I will be telling you the names. And he tells us about these 4 people. This is how the stanza begins. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument, until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers when, young and beautiful, she rode to harriers? Okay, so the first person mentioned here is a woman, and he says that she had spent her days in ignorant goodwill. Now here the reference is to the lady called Countess Constance Markievicz. Countess Constance Markievicz, who was a very popular person in these aristocratic circles, and Yeats too had a lot of friends in the higher echelons of society, and he was personally acquainted with Countess Constance Markievicz. And so she was an aristocrat. She was married to a Polish count. That is how she got the name Markievicz. She herself came from an aristocratic family. She was well educated. She was also an artist, and that woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument. Okay, so ignorant goodwill. She spent her time in ignorant goodwill. Means you can sense there that Yeats was not very happy with her involvement in this rebellion, because he says that ignorant goodwill, in the sense she thought she was doing something good, but she was ignorant. She was actually not doing anything good. So that is the idea there. She thought she was doing something great in involving in the rebellion, and she spent her energy in ignorant goodwill, and she spent long nights arguing, supporting, fighting for the cause of Ireland, until her voice grew shrill, her voice grew sharp, her voice grew hoarse from speaking her mind, from speaking for Ireland. What voice more sweet than hers when, young and beautiful, she rode the harriers? And he says, now he knew her maybe from the time she was young, and he says her voice was much sweeter when she was young and beautiful, and she rode to the harriers. Now harriers is a term related to hunting, and she, like any other aristocratic young lady, had spent her youth hunting and partying and doing the usual things that aristocratic women do. And so her voice was much sweeter when she led that kind of a life, but now the constant arguing and fighting and shouting has made her voice shrill and hoarse, and he seems to disapprove of her involvement in the rebellion, as I mentioned earlier. So there is this voice of regret. Why couldn't she remain what she was earlier with a sweet voice? Why did she get involved in all these things? And to tell you a few things more about this Constance Markievicz, when the rebels were rounded up and arrested, she too was caught, but then she was spared when the others were put to death. The others were shot, but maybe because she was a woman, she was spared of that. And later on, and she was put in prison for life imprisonment, but after a few years or months, she was released. She continued to be an activist, involving in a lot of activities against Britain, and later on she also contested the elections and won the elections, but then she refused to say the oath in the name of the British king, and so she could not take the seat because she adamantly refused to say the oath. Okay, so she was, and as her name says, she was very constant in her beliefs. So none of this is mentioned here in the poem. All that is said here is that she had spent, she could have spent a lot of happy times in her in the kind of life that she was used to, but then she got involved in this. The poet now goes on to the next person. He says, "This man had kept a school and rode our winged horse." So here the reference is to the person called Patriarch Pierce. Patriarch Pierce. and he had kept a school. He was an educationist and a reformist. He had started a college of his own, and he was also a writer. He was an acclaimed poet in Ireland at the time of his death and at the time of his involvement in this Irish movement. And that is why it is said here that he rode our winged horse. Winged horse symbolizes imagination. So Yeats says that this man was a gifted poet, Padraic Pierce. And then now the third person, this other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. Now this again seems to be a person for whom Yeats had a special fondness, because Yeats says that this other, his helper, that is this third person that is mentioned here, was a helper and a follower of the earlier one, of Padraic Pierce. And this young man's name was Thomas MacDonagh. And he says he was just coming into his force. He was a very young man in his early 20s, and he too was a budding poet. He would have become a great writer. He was a very sensitive person, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. He was such a nice young man, so talented, so sensitive, so daring. And had he lived longer, he would have definitely become famous. But so that's why he says he was just coming into his force. He was just, beginning to blossom, beginning to develop his artistic talents. Had he been here for long, he would definitely have proved himself as a talented writer. But unfortunately, that goes without saying, unfortunately, because of his involvement in the Easter Rising, his life was cut short. So that is about Thomas MacDonagh. This other man I had dreamed, a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who were near my heart. Yet I number him in the song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Then the fourth man. It is about this man that he talks the most. And there, it is not his love for this man that induces him to speak more, but it is actually his disdain or his hatred for the man. And he says, this fourth man, I had thought of him, I had dreamed of him as a drunken, vainglorious lout. A lout is a good-for-nothing person. A drunken person, of course, is an intoxicated man. Vainglorious, somebody who used to boast about himself. A good-for-nothing lout. And so he says, about this fourth man, I'm quite surprised, because I had thought of him as a drunken, vainglorious lout. Now here he's talking about the man called Major John McBride. And why is it that Yeats did not like this man? Because Yeats was very much in love with a lady, an actress and an activist called Maud Gonne. Maud, M-A-U-D, Gonne, G-O-N-N-E. And Maud Gonne, but never reciprocated his feelings, and instead she married this Major John McBride. And later on, the marriage fell on difficult times and they got separated too. So at the time this poem was written, Maud Gonne was already separated from Major John McBride. But then Yeats still counted him his enemy, because he had hurt the feelings of somebody he had held very dear. That is why he says here, he had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart. So he had hurt people who I hold close to my heart. That is why I don't like this fellow. But yet, in spite of my personal prejudices and personal dislike, I still include him in this list of heroes, because I cannot kind of ignore what he has done. So Yeats overcomes his petty prejudices and counts this Major John McBride as one among the heroes. Yet I number him in the song, that is, I add him in my poem. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. So now life has suddenly taken a very a drastic turn, and people who were considered as ordinary men, common men, clowns earlier, wearing motley, this man has resigned his part from there, and no longer can we think of him as a clown, as a common man. Now he has been elevated to the ranks of a hero. So here, that's why he says, he too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. So such an unexpected transformation has occurred. I did not expect that this man is capable of such heroism. But believe it or not, he was one among those heroes who were executed. And so I have to accept that he is a brave man. So that is what Yeats tells about this fourth person, Major John McBride. And so that is the end of stanza 2.